12 meters down, in a shaft cut into the limestone shelf at the edge of the Saqqara plateau, the first thing the lamp catches is not a face, it is dust, undisturbed for over 2,000 years, lying in a fine, unbroken layer across a painted coffin lid. Above ground, the present day goes on as it always has. Down here, nothing has moved since a set of hands lowered this box into the rock, packed the shaft above it with rubble and limestone blocks, and walked away. That happened around 2020, when archaeologists opened this particular shaft near Saqqara's animal necropolis and found it stacked with more sealed coffins than anyone expected, none of them touched since burial. This shaft, though, is young by the standards of the ground it sits in. Under this same stretch of desert, older shafts, deeper shafts, stranger shafts, have been opened across the last century, and almost none of them held what the people who sealed them seem to have intended. Saqqara is usually introduced with one fact. It holds the Step Pyramid of Djoser, the oldest complete stone building known to survive anywhere in the world, raised around 2650 BC under the king's architect, Imhotep. The plateau gets described as a burial ground, built to keep the dead safe and sealed away from the living. That description is accurate as far as it goes. It is also where most explanations stop, and stopping there misses what actually happens almost every time one of these shafts finally gets opened. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. None of what follows is presented as finished archaeology. Some of it is documented, catalogued, and sitting in Egyptian museum storerooms right now. Some of it is still argued about by the people who dug it up. I will try to keep those two things separate as we go, because the difference matters more here than almost anywhere else in Egypt. Start at the center, with the shaft the story is actually named for. Imhotep's builders cut it straight down through the bedrock underneath the pyramid itself, roughly 28 meters, about the height of a 9-story building, to reach the king's own burial chamber. The chamber is lined in pink granite, hauled from quarries at Aswan, 800 kilometers south along the Nile. The pyramid above it did not begin as a pyramid at all. It started as a single flat-topped mastaba, the standard tomb shape of the era, and was enlarged and heightened in stages until it reached 6 unequal steps, the first time any Egyptian structure on this scale had been raised entirely in stone rather than mud brick. When the French Egyptologist Jean-Philippe Lauer, working with the excavators Cecil Firth and James Quibel, finally cleared a path down to that chamber in the 1920s, they found the entrance sealed behind a granite plug weighing several tons, shaped and fitted to close the opening rather than merely cover it. Ancient robbers had already been inside, long before the excavators arrived, tunneling in around the seal rather than through it. What was left in the chamber by the time modern archaeologists reached it amounted to almost nothing, a scatter of bone fragments, and among them, by the excavator's own account, a single mummified left foot, wrapped in linen. That foot is the closest thing that exists to physical remains of the king who built the first stone pyramid on Earth. The main shaft was never the only one. Sunk into the bedrock beneath the pyramid's superstructure are 11 additional shafts, cut for other members of the royal family, most of them lined the same way, most of them sealed the same way. One of the galleries connected to these shafts is decorated with blue faience tiles set into the limestone to imitate a woven reed palace wall, the same technique used later elsewhere at the site, alongside carved limestone relief panels showing Djoser himself performing the running ritual of the said festival, a ceremony meant to renew a king's strength and his right to rule. Inside one of the smaller sarcophagi recovered from this network, cut for a child, excavators found nothing but a scatter of bone too fragmentary to identify with confidence. The relief panels survive. The rituals they depict are documented in detail elsewhere in Egyptian religious practice. What survives far less clearly is who, specifically, each of these 11 shafts was cut for, and why several of them, like the main chamber above them, turned out to hold almost nothing at all by the time anyone reached the bottom. Excavators reached these shafts one at a time across several seasons in the early 20th century, never all at once, since each new one meant clearing rubble that ancient robbers had left behind after forcing their own way in through side tunnels, rather than the sealed shaft heads themselves. Cut into the rock beneath the pyramid is a grid of galleries and corridors running for several kilometers, and inside them Lauer and Firth found storage magazines packed with stone vessels, bowls, jars, plates, and cups carved from alabaster, schist, breccia, and diorite. The final tally ran past 40,000 pieces. A number of them carry the names of kings who reigned 1 and 2 dynasties before Djoser, rulers whose deaths predated his own reign by a century or more. A burial shaft does not need 40,000 second-hand dishes belonging to dead men. Nothing about a funeral requires storing a previous dynasty's tableware 200 years deep under a new king's monument. The vessels themselves are not in dispute. They are catalogued and on display in Egyptian museum collections today. What they were doing under Djoser's pyramid is the open question. Some researchers treat them as royal heirlooms too significant to discard, moved and reburied as reverence for an older lineage. Others read the gesture differently, as a deliberate consolidation, an entire dynasty's ritual property gathered from wherever it had been kept and sealed somewhere it could never be retrieved again. Nothing in the vessels themselves settles which reading is closer to true. Some of the finer pieces are carved so thin that light passes through the stone, a level of control over hard, brittle material that took specialized workshops generations to refine, long before Djoser's reign began. A second shaft, smaller and far less visited, sits inside its own enclosure south of the main pyramid. It drops to a chamber lined in blue faience tiles, set to imitate the reed matting that would have hung on the walls of a royal residence, and at the bottom of it is a second granite sarcophagus, sealed with the same care as the one under the pyramid itself. Egyptologists call it the South Tomb, and the argument over its purpose has never fully settled. Djoser only had one body to bury. This structure duplicates nearly everything the main pyramid already provides: a shaft, a granite chamber, a sealed sarcophagus, a full set of ritual rooms attached to it. One explanation ties it to the Sed festival, on the theory that the ceremony required a symbolic second burial for the king while he still lived. Another treats it as a repository connected to mummification, built to hold something removed from the body rather than the body itself. Whichever reading is correct, something was judged worth sealing behind a second granite plug that had nothing to do with protecting a second corpse, because there never was one. The clearest case of a shaft holding the opposite of what everyone expected sits a short walk from Djoser's enclosure, under what is now called the Buried Pyramid. In 1954, the Egyptian archaeologist Zakaria Gonim uncovered a shaft belonging to Sekhemkhet, generally identified as Djoser's successor, and followed it down to a burial chamber that appeared completely undisturbed. The alabaster sarcophagus inside still had its sliding front panel mortared shut, and resting on top of it sat a dried wreath of flowers, apparently placed there during the original funeral and never touched again. There was no robber's tunnel anywhere nearby, no breach in the seal at any point. By every physical sign available, this was the one royal burial at Saqqara that had genuinely never been opened since the day it was closed. Gonim invited government officials and members of the press to witness the sarcophagus opened in front of them, expecting to reveal the first fully intact royal burial found in Egypt in decades. The panel was raised, the chamber was empty, no body, no jewelry, no funerary goods of any kind, nothing but a thin, undisturbed layer of dust that had settled since the day the panel went in. Nobody has produced a fully satisfying explanation since. One argument holds that the king died before the tomb was finished and was buried somewhere that has never been located, leaving this sarcophagus as an empty formality. Another holds that the burial did take place and was removed through some access point that left no visible trace, which is difficult to square with an intact seal and an undisturbed wreath. The seal was real, the emptiness was real. The two facts do not comfortably explain each other, and that is exactly where the honest version of this story has to stop. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. 3 shafts, cut within roughly 2 centuries of each other by builders working under 2 different kings, produced 3 different outcomes. One held almost nothing, robbed clean but for a single foot. One held tens of thousands of objects that belonged to kings already generations dead before construction even began. One held nothing at all, and was never touched by a thief in the first place. If the only job of a royal burial shaft was protecting a body from robbery, only one of those three outcomes should exist. Instead, there are three, and none of them looks like ordinary bad luck. The pattern runs further back than Djoser, and it kept running long after him. Beneath the plateau, older galleries belonging to the Second Dynasty kings Sekhemkhet, Raneb, and Ninetjer, Djoser's own predecessors, extend for hundreds of meters through the bedrock, cut and sealed a century or more before Imhotep's crew ever broke ground. One of these networks branches into well over 100 separate chambers and side rooms, making it one of the largest subterranean complexes anywhere in Egypt, and large sections of it remain too unstable for archaeologists to enter safely even now. Cutting any of this by hand, through solid limestone and later through granite far harder than the tools available to work it, was not a small undertaking. Builders across these dynasties relied on copper chisels for the softer stone, dolerite pounders to rough out granite before it was ever polished, and wooden wedges soaked with water to split blocks along a chosen line as the wood swelled. The granite itself was quarried at Aswan, roughed into shape on site to save weight, and floated north on barges during the Nile's summer flood, when the river rose high enough to bring heavy cargo close to the building site. Moving stone that size by river was its own logistical undertaking, one most modern engineers would still respect. None of this is mysterious. It is documented, replicated by modern experimental archaeologists, and it represents a difficult, skilled body of work carried out by people who deserve credit for it rather than doubt. What remains unresolved is not how the shafts were physically cut. It is why so many of them, across so many reigns, were built only to be sealed around something that was never meant to be recovered. Which returns to where this story started. Beginning around 2020 and continuing into the following year, Egyptian archaeologists working the same plateau, near the animal necropolis known as the Bubasteion, opened a series of shafts that had nothing to do with Djoser's era at all. These were cut more than 2,000 years later, during Egypt's late period, and together they held over 100 sealed wooden coffins, stacked one above another, their painted surfaces still bright under a coat of undisturbed dust, several still holding mummies wrapped with jewelry intact, none of them disturbed since the day they went into the ground. The method had not changed in 2,000 years. Cut a vertical shaft into the same stretch of bedrock, lower whatever needs sealing to the bottom, seal the opening with stone and mortar, and leave. Different dynasty, different century, the same instinct, expressed on the same plateau, over and over, for 3,000 years. That repetition is the real subject here, more than any single tomb. Saqqara was never one burial ground, built once and left alone. It was used, reused, and resealed by generation after generation of Egyptians who kept returning to the same ground with the same idea, that some things, whether a body, an inheritance of an older dynasty's possessions, or a solemn and ultimately empty gesture, belonged sealed in the rock and out of reach. Only a fraction of the plateau has ever been opened at all. Not every sealed space at Saqqara belongs to a king. West of the Step Pyramid, cut into the bedrock, runs a different kind of gallery altogether, one built to hold the mummified remains of the Apis bull, an animal the Egyptians treated as a living manifestation of the god Ptah. The complex is known today as the Serapeum, and its main corridor is lined with side chambers, each one built to receive a single granite sarcophagus weighing, in some cases, close to 70 tons, hauled down a passage barely wider than the boxes themselves. The entrance had been lost to drifting sand for centuries by the time the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette went looking for it in 1851, working only from a description written by the ancient geographer Strabo of an avenue lined with sphinxes leading to a buried temple. Mariette found the head of one sphinx protruding from the sand, then another, and followed the buried line of them until he reached the sealed entrance itself. Once inside, he found most of the chambers already robbed. One was not. Sealed behind its own blocked doorway sat a chamber untouched since the burial that closed it, and in the dust on its floor were the bare footprints of the men who had carried out that final sealing, along with a loaf of bread one of them appears to have left behind. Nobody has ever produced a fully satisfying account of how sarcophagi that size were moved and positioned inside corridors that narrow, using only the tools known to have existed at the time. Ramps and sledges explain the transport in general terms. They do not fully explain the precision of the final placement, where some of these boxes sit fitted into their side chambers with almost no clearance at all. Even the most thoroughly examined of these shafts still has an unresolved piece sitting inside it. The vessel galleries under Djoser's pyramid have been catalogued for close to a century, and there is still no consensus on why so many of the pieces predate the king who sealed them in. A minority position argues the vessels represent deliberate erasure, a way of removing an earlier dynasty's ritual property from circulation permanently, rather than an act of reverence toward it. That reading is possible. It has not been proven, and nothing currently in the archaeological record settles it either way. The honest position is that the vessels tell us something was moved, hidden, and never meant to be recovered, without telling us why anyone thought that was necessary. The same limitation applies to the South Tomb's sealed second sarcophagus, and to whatever the more recent radar surveys have picked up beneath sections of the plateau that have never been excavated at all. Egypt's antiquities authorities have referenced additional shafts identified in recent seasons but not yet opened, logged for future work rather than described in any detail. Nobody currently working the site claims to know exactly how many sealed chambers remain under Saqqara. Estimates for how much of the plateau is still unexcavated run as high as the majority of it. Put together, the pattern across every shaft opened so far argues against the simplest explanation, that a royal burial shaft's only purpose was keeping a body safe from robbery. Djoser's own chamber proves that protection failed even at the site built with the most care in the entire complex. What worked, consistently, across every example examined here, was concealment itself. The vessels stayed hidden for roughly 4,500 years. Sekhemkhet's sealed emptiness stayed hidden until 1954. The Serapeum's untouched chamber survived not because its seal was clever, but because nobody who knew where to look ever came back for it, the same accident of neglect that protected the late-period coffins near the Bubasteion until archaeologists reached them within the last several years. Whatever these shafts were actually built to accomplish, sealing something away from view, sometimes permanently, worked far better across 3,000 years than sealing it away from thieves ever did. Even the failures make the same point from the other direction. Every time a shaft was breached early, by robbers within a generation or two of the burial, whatever the builders meant to keep hidden was lost almost immediately. It is only the ones that stayed sealed, sometimes for millennia, that ever delivered anything resembling what was originally placed inside them. Most of Saqqara has still never been opened. Surveys conducted across the plateau in recent decades have identified void spaces and corridor patterns consistent with additional shafts and galleries, some directly beneath ground that visitors now walk over on the way to the Step Pyramid, logged for future excavation seasons rather than opened yet. Nobody working the site will put a firm number on how many sealed spaces remain, only that the plateau keeps producing them faster than anyone can clear them. Every excavation season at Saqqara for the past 200 years has turned up at least one shaft nobody knew was there, and there is no reason to think this season, or the next one, will be the last. Somewhere under that stretch of desert, in a shaft nobody has cut a way into yet, something sealed by hands that stopped moving 3,000 years ago or more is still sitting exactly where it was left, in the dark, waiting on whoever eventually gets there first. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.